Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us again. This panel is entitled Deep Shit, Excrement Management and Modern Sensibilities. And our first speaker is Professor Christopher Otter from Ohio State University. Professor Otter is a specialist in modern British history with particular focus on the history of science, technology, and public health, environmental history, and the history of food. He's published articles in numerous journals, including journals of British studies, cultural geographies, food and history, and history of technology. He's currently completing his book, Diet for a Large Planet, Food System, World Ecology and the Making of Industrial Britain. This book is global in focus and explores the causes, consequences, and experience of a shift to a diet rich in animal protein, wheat, and sugar. These consequences include novel regulatory systems, geostrategic visions, bodily transitions, and ecological vulnerabilities. Professor Otter is also working on two new projects. The first is a deep history of our planet's newest sphere, the technosphere. This history will be told by utilizing a fivefold scalar structure, equipment, capsules, networks, antronome, and anthropogenic sinks. The second is an exploration of the relations between technology and neurodiversity since 1800. Both histories aim to situate our ecological, biological, phenomenological, and psychological relationship with our technological niche within a deeper historical context. Professor,
can we get this up behind us?
To raise it?
Yeah, well, we need to. No, we can't see the thing, right? We need to get this. So let's.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit on this side.
Should have asked before we started.
Yeah.
Is it coming up? Let's just get it to the beginning, shall we? Scroll up to the top. That's cool.
That's it.
Thank you. Yeah, from beginning.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much, and I'd like particularly to thank On and After for inviting me to this wonderful workshop, and also to Asaf for his help. I'd also like to thank you for planting some trees in honor of me. It at the very least does assuage some of the guilt that comes with long distance travel. Now I want to begin with a quote here from the great French historian Alain Corbin. In a century too hastily defined as that of money, the major cleavages were ordered around the distinction between immediacy and the imposition of delays, the submission to direct contact, and the capacity to keep a distance. And this is Corbin writing about the 19th century. Much recent scholarship, I think, this might be something of a crude characterization, but risks eliding the history of human-made ecological devastation with the history of capitalism. And we saw some of this yesterday with the discussion of Jason Moore's work. His term, Capitalocene, reflects this idea that ecological history and the history of capitalism are effectively one and the same thing. If we are going to keep the word Anthropocene and use it, we need to interrogate what this anthropos has become, and how the anthropos became this way. How we historicize the anthropos becomes significant. What were the characteristics of humans that have caused environmental calamity? Are they simply, and have they simply been, rapacious capitalists following the inexorable logic of capital? As Corbin suggests here, there might be more to this than meets the eye. We might take another approach and revisit the history of emotions, of senses, of perceptions, affect, and bodily comportment, and look at the role of these things in massive global environmental change. As Marco Almiero and Paolo Di Rosa put it in a recent article, Political Effluvia. As scholars, we are not trained to follow our senses, even less our emotions. So what I want to invite you to do today is to follow me into the sensory Anthropocene. Now, Alan Corbin is famous particularly for writing a book called The Foul and the Fragrant, in which he explored the late 18th and early 19th century emergence in France of a new sensibility towards the organic, manifested particularly through transformed experiences of smell. And this is what he calls a, quote, far-reaching anthropological transformation that had vast and relatively unexplored social implications. It also has vast ecological implications which have yet to be fully unraveled. Two of the key phenomenological products here were increased repulsion towards excrement and a desire for distance between human bodies. As numerous historians have shown, this Western bourgeois perceptual transition was manifest in historically specific modes of cleanliness, which focused on washing the entire body with clean water, in exercises primarily about hygiene and self-discipline, rather than primarily about matters spiritual or regenerative or pleasurable. These techniques formed a hygienic self, and which was formed in turn within hygienic domestic space. One cleans one's body and one cleans one's home. Now, while such tactics of deodorization, as Corbin memorably put it, formed alongside the Industrial Revolution, they can't simply be regarded as epiphenomena of capital accumulation. These were semi-autonomous somatic shifts. So this disgust that Corbin describes was materially and historically specific. And while historically constituted, it was also shaped by the affordances of the organic. It's worth noting that Corbin points out that smoke never elicited disgust. It might produce irritation, preclude clear vision, but it did not create the same type of visceral response that excrement did. Some people like mineral stenches. They go and smell gasoline or smell oil refineries. I grew up near two large oil refineries. People like to go and smell the oil refinery. They thought it was pleasant. These are serious jokes, I think. And we might view the phenomenological history of plastics in this light. Plastics are smooth, indestructible, entirely without smell. They do not rot. This became the material par excellence of the new sensibility. Its accumulation in the oceans inspires very different visceral feelings than stepping in a dog turd. Hence the rush to enfold the offending article in non-biodegradable plastic, which is what I have to do when I take my dog for a walk every single day, because Americans cannot tolerate this. Plastic has become far more tolerable than excrement. A parallel shift, somatic and perceptual, is the reconfiguration of comfort. Witold Rybczynski observes the contemporaneous emergence of, and I quote, a new sense of contentment brought about by enjoyment of one's physical surroundings. Comfort should be undramatic, calming. It requires its somatic apparatus of pillows, cushions, mattresses, and chairs. It would later be colonized by engineers with their comfort charts, their comfort equations, and their comfort zone, the calculus of atmospheric control. But water sat at the center of this system. It was the agent and the index of sensory transition. It had magical powers. Going back to our lunchtime conversation, this is a constipation cure from the late 19th century. It's magic powers of the hydraulic. And the water closet, particularly after the invention of the S-bend and the proliferation of commercial disinfectants, became the sign that humanity had broken its phenomenological link with its own excrement. This was a colonial technology. As John Pudney put it, in the smallest room, in the four corners of the earth. British culture and civilization left its mark in those pre-propaganda days in the polite, untranslated, variously pronounced but highly prized terms, water closet and WC. And in its British and American form, you get this kind of porcelain capsule, a whitening mechanism with obvious racial connotations. And as a side note here, and as yet unexplored dimension of this, is the subjection of animals to the same regime. This was no longer to be tolerated, this kind of cow. One had to clean the cow. And even battery chickens were subjected to apparatus designed to remove their excrement. This is a folding roll at the bottom. They would shit overnight, and you would sort of roll this along so it doesn't accumulate too much, and they keep laying their eggs. This is also a story of air, of heat, and of carefully controlled domestic envelopes. According to Markham in a book, Climate and Civilization, Climate and the Energy of Nations, published in 1947, England became a land of warm, dry houses. Well, it didn't really, but nevertheless, you can see the sort of point he's making here is a certain kind of architectural and engineering achievement of a particular type of atmosphere. Now, Peter Sloterdijk has argued that the artificial sealed world can, under certain circumstances, become the only possible environment for its inhabitants. I don't want to return everyone to the recent capsule tour that we just took around the green building here. But Leuven de Korte has referred to this as the Capsule of Civilization, Sloterdijk, the great introversion. Here we are inside it now. But the roots of this capsular revolution lay in sensory changes that made organic emanations and dirty outsides untrustworthy and unbearable. And I think the phenomenology of this shift is vital to any historical understanding of how we've got where we've got. Cleanliness and comfort came to permeate public spaces, as Nancy Tomes famously showed, in hotels, in cinemas, in railways, shaping every dimension of our bodily comportment in ways and tactics discussed by Michel Foucault. Sanitary capsules can be stacked into gigantic skyscrapers. Wealthy Westerners inhabit a capsular archipelago. I traveled to Tel Aviv via capsule after capsule after capsule without ever really entering any kind of outside, except for a couple of minutes at the airport. Sanitary capsules are, of course, not necessarily healthy. They are full of synthetic miasmas, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, formaldehyde, radon, asbestos, and synthetic fibers, as well as novel organisms forming the indoor biome. And these materials have generated strange emergent conditions, total allergy syndrome, chemical hypersensitivity syndrome. So as wealthy or relatively privileged Westerners, we now live in these kind of sanitary comfort machines, small-scale enclaves of extreme atmospheric control. These enclaves, of course, run on vast networks, supplying water, energy, food, plastic, and information, and they belch their waste back into the outside. So extreme atmospheric order and entropic atmospheric disorder are interwoven and interlinked. Encapsulation warps planetary metabolism. These seductive inner climates and control centers are shielded from an increasingly polluted, warming world outside. The two are clearly materially connected. But the circumstances here are ultimately visceral as much as they are capitalistic. They do, however, connect our everyday lives to enormous anthropogenic sinks, the plastic ocean, aquatic dead zones, urban heat canyons, and climate change itself. Okay. That's all very general. I want to spend the rest of this talk talking about a single, humble technology that we've abandoned. We never really fully tried it out, and this is the earth closet. Return to 19th century Europe, the area of Corman's focus, and one would find a riotous proliferation of toilet systems. Ash pits, fossmobile, privies, cesspools existed in all kinds of forms, in which waste accumulated and then was ultimately disposed of. These technologies attracted the ire of sanitary reformers, these people who were operating with the new sensory apparatus found these things the absolute epitome of disgust. These things had to be removed. But the solution was not necessarily the water closet. Other media were explored. Dutch engineer Charles Lignot, his pneumatic system used vacuum power to pump feces to central stations where they would be processed into fertilizer. And this was used heavily in Amsterdam from 1870 to the early 20th century. Well over 100,000 residents were served by this system. There were pneumatic technologies installed in Prague, St. Petersburg, Vienna. A Berlier system in France was fairly similar. Some systems combined the hydraulic and the pneumatic. This is a grand era of experimentation in waste media. And another potential medium was earth. In the late 1850s, a British vicar called Henry Moule devised his earth closet. And you can see the earth closet here, a sort of galvanized iron pan, a wooden framework, and here is a receptacle containing earth. And when one had finished, one simply flushed the earth into the pan, and the earth would mix with the excrement and form workable compost or fertilizer. They used peat in Germany. This could apparently produce inoffensive fertilizer. The system could be activated by a lever, or it was self-acting. Earth closets came in many forms. Some separated urine and excrement, such as this particular system here. Some included domestic waste. Some were mobile. There were gliding commodes that you could get. Some were fixed. Some were individual. Some came in groups. The system required a regular earth supply and synchronized recovery by scavenging teams who collected the material for processing. Now, the earth closet was promoted as a technology which precluded water pollution, reduced miasmas, and replenished the soil. Waterborne systems, by contrast, displaced human waste, and I quote, by heedlessly casting it out of sight into a vast network of underground pipes and monster tunnels, forming an enormous laboratory of pestiferous gases, which was routinely regurgitated back into houses. This was the dreaded Victorian sewer gas. If you want to use Latour here, water was a treacherous mediator. Dumping human waste into rivers merely created pollution and disease. The earth closet then, in some ways, aligned with new sensibilities. You can see this advert here, no bad smells, no unwholesome cesspools. This is promoted as being aligned with the new sensory order. Earth, declared the engineer Thomas Hawksley, more of him later, was, and I quote, the natural deodorizer, a benign neutralizer of all that's offensive. One medical officer of health declared that he has positioned his nostrils, and I quote again, in close contact with soils recovered from the earth closets without taking the slightest offense. The Earth Closet Company advertised the product in 1871 by announcing that it enabled nature's wants to be attended to in comfort instead of the usual disgusting surroundings. And it put the word comfort in capital letters, which meant it was very serious. The Earth Closet also recycled human excrement. This is George Vivian Poor from his essays in Rural Hygiene, written in the 1870s originally. A nation which imports a great part of its food and a great part of its manure, and systematically and by act of parliament throws all its organic refuse into the sea, is living on its capital. And Poor's crops were produced from fertilizer made from his earth closets. Otherwise, nitrogen and phosphorus simply leached into the, quote, never-restoring ocean. Again, a bad media. This is a version of this kind of model. We have broken a chain here. And the Victorians were well aware that this chain had been broken. Water was a dissipative medium, earth a conserving one, producing a closed loop rather than entropic hydraulic dissipation. Even sewage farms simply produced diluted, debased fertilizer. The American economist Henry Carey called waterborne systems a robbery system. Justus von Liebig revered East Asian recycling systems. For Hawksley, the engineer I spoke about a minute or so ago, waterborne systems were tearing the earth in two. And I quote from him here. How easy it is to see now the plan was opening a great sluice for the outpouring without possibility of return of the nation's wealth and people's food, while at the same time it was invoking the birth of a monster that should overshadow every city with its baneful and destructive influence. This ultimately epitomized what Marx would call the metabolic rift, an irreparable rift in the interdependent processes of social metabolism, a metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of life itself. So the water closet was ripping the rural and the urban in two. The earth closet's terrestrial media also would heal the rift and provoke natural order. Cats, advocates were very fond of pointing out, buried their waste rather than hoarding it in, and I quote again, tanks and vaults. Instead of importing South American guano, each house would become its own guano mine. These were literally micro mines. The doctor and earth closet enthusiast Francis Taylor, author of British Guano, described the results as producing something, and I quote again, portable and inodorous, which has lost its disgusting appearance, being more like a coprolite or dung-stone than anything I can describe. And by this time, the 1860s, the British had already dug up all of their coprolite and used it for fertilizer before moving on to guano. His closets performed a kind of accelerated fossilization, where excrement, they used turntables and heating apparatus to rapidly produce guano within the earth closet itself. Moule claimed that the repeated use of soil magnified its fertilizing powers, and that more repeated use might bring it up to the value of guano, which was the most valuable fertilizer on the market. Prescriptions for home-made guano abounded. Liebig compared human excrement to guano. John Thudicum, a Liebigian chemist and expert on urine, wine, and gallstones, declared every chamber pot to be a penny savings bank. And estimates were that Great Britain and Ireland would save around £6 million annually if they used their solid excrement. It's also worth noting here that this was also often promoted as a biblical technology. If we return everything to the earth, this is God's natural alchemy, and so forth. Finally, the earth closet was simple. It was low-tech. It had no expensive machinery. It was a small technological system in an age when systems were going large. Pneumatic systems, one text argued, were ingenious, but they were subjected to potential technological breakdown. So what happened to the earth closet? In the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, there are lots of descriptions of the system being used in private houses, in prisons, in asylums. It was introduced and patented in the United States by George Waring. British administrators introduced it into India. A casual study of reports of medical officers of health shows the earth closet surviving as a rural technology well into the 20th century. For example, in 1956, the Midhurst District Association of Port and Councils noted there was no sewage system in the village and everybody used earth closets. Householders, I quote, had to use their small gardens for disposal purposes, as if this was a problem. Because people were actually closing the loop, but this was already seen as quite clearly as sanitarily and civilizationally problematic. Earth closets were attracting entirely inappropriate adjectives like medieval. Of course, in multiple forms, composting toilets are used around the world, often in quite high-tech forms. This is a passive solar composting toilet. The Multrum toilet from Sweden is probably the most high-tech version around. It's pioneered from the 1930s, and plenty of people advocate what's called, I say plenty of people, it's a fairly minor thing, but people do advocate the use of humanure. I used a vacuum toilet when I flew over here to Tel Aviv. We use them on planes. So there's never been full closure around the water closet, but we don't use them in our homes or our hotels. The system can't be called a failure in a technological sense, but it is a highly marginal Western technology. And this becomes the sort of speculative bit. We need to sort of look at precisely why this was the case. It's never shed its connection to the small scale, the rural, and the backward. The more paved and concretized and expansive urban areas became, it simply became hard to get hold of earth and to provide it to people in towns. Networked, tubular, hydraulic solutions enabled cities to grow more and more disconnected from the soil. Now, slow shifts in sensoria were almost certainly the most important significant thing here. In 1863, Moule noted how there was a disinclination to discuss, quote, offensive things. These often precluded the earth closet's adoption. Physically handling one's own excrement, even in dried or deodorized, pulverized form, clashed with Corbin's new sensibility. As Corbin notes, to, quote, rid the masses of their animal fetidity, to keep them at a distance from excrement. And if you look to today's website for the Multrum, which is about as high-tech as it gets, it states, cultural perceptions of handling human excrement provide a tough barrier to integrate the practice into households. It's also worth noting it's hard to put them in capsules. You can't imagine using earth closets in the Burj Khalifa, for example, so it would be rather difficult to stack earth closets quite that high. There were obviously issues related to cholera here. There's a lot of other reasons swirling around. In addition, the system relied upon human attention and the potentially disquieting proximity of excrement. Earth had to be applied. Feces lingered in pans. Collection teams carted it away. Water performed all of these activities without the need for human involvement. It enabled excrement to be forgotten. Some reports declared that the much vaunted deodorizing powers of the earth closet were actually exaggerated. The easy availability of guano, odorless, and nitrates, and later synthetic fertilizers that we discussed in the paper yesterday, along with the decline of traditional recycling mentalities, cemented commitments to large technological systems and vast streams of waste. In 1925, Sir Joseph Robertson reflected, it's taken 60 years of patient trial to get the public to recognize that in a town dwelling, all substitutes for water closets prove in the end unsatisfactory and expensive. And there was a chorus across all sanitary publications declaring closure around the water closet system. British-style waterborne systems were now pervading France. They were replacing pneumatic closets in Amsterdam. Such systems and the new sensibility locked in together. They were mutually reinforcing and momentum generating. Corban noted the immediate removal of excreta drowned in a stream of water as obviously the most effective deodorization technique for both public and private space. A small but voluble minority, composters, organicists, humanurists, continued to laud the earth closet and vilify water closets. The organic pioneer Edgar Saxon declared the switch to waterborne systems being one of the most gigantic breaks in the natural order which our race has made. The self-sufficiency guru John Seymour, a hero of composters around the world, carped in 1976, the fear of basic function seems to be part of the modern human condition, which finds the idea of dealing with waste and death extremely challenging. The flush toilet is a remarkably expensive way to pollute fresh drinking water while at the same time wasting the very nutrients that are essential to maintain fertility in the soil. He was describing the very end product of Anthropocene formation excavated by Corban, the production of a society of hypersensitive wasters on a massive scale. So just a couple of words in conclusion. The tale of the earth closet is a tangled history indeed, a story of sensibilities, technology's waste, a story also of affect, of media and metabolism. It threads our everyday bodily functions to disturbed planetary nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, uniting our toilets and farms with vast aquatic dead zones and anxieties about peak phosphorus. As I noted at the start, there's a long history of collapsing this history into a generalized one of capitalism, of which the Capitalocene is the logical end product. We see it with today's eco-Marxism. Palpably, capitalism is central to this process, but it's not the whole story. When Jason Moore, whose work I've used extensively and has been very influential, argues we can begin to comprehend the rural-urban dialectic as the overarching eco-geographical framework of the modern world. The cycling of nutrients and water between town and country has been progressively disrupted over the past 5 centuries of capitalist development, requiring successive spatial fixes, large and small. I would also argue that aversion to excrement and decay, rising repugnance to bodily odours and emissions underlie the metabolic rifts, this sort of foundational spatial aspect of the entire Anthropocene. Subtle shifts in regimes of disgust and attitudes to the organic made earth closets viscerally provocative in ways water closets simply were not. It is too tempting to reduce this simply to a logic of profit and economic rationality. Human material interactions are profoundly effective, historical, and capricious. This far-reaching anthropological transformation of which Corban wrote shaped our affective priorities, our visceral responses, produced new types of human beings and new types of elemental media, to use a term coined by John Durham Peters in his book, The Marvelous Clouds. Moreover, and I want to be speculative here, or even more speculative, which is what we've been encouraged to do, a counter-sensibility was already forming, which revered and was attracted to the mineral, the synthetic, the artificial. Our relationship to plastic is a toxic love story, but it's a love story nonetheless. It's certainly not a disgusting one. One final example will suffice. In 1970, the botanist, New Zealand botanist, Sir Enoch Levy, was in New Zealand and experiencing the intensive airborne application of phosphate fertilizer. The plane is above him. It's dropping processed synthetic dung on the ground at an industrial scale. This is like a gigantic flying pneumatic toilet. And it's dropping it on his head. And he says, "I thrilled at the aerial top-dressing trials in 1949 when I felt the phosphate raining on me from the skies." He would not have said the same thing if he was standing in a shower of shit. Thank you very much.